In the summer of 1932, a government nurse arrived in Macon County, Alabama, with a message. She went door to door across the rural county, knocking on the doors of sharecroppers' cabins, stopping men in the cotton fields, spreading word through the churches and the small general stores. The message was simple. The United States government was offering free medical care, free meals, and, in a county where most families could not afford to bury their dead with any dignity, free burial insurance. All the men had to do was come in for an examination. For men who had never once in their lives seen a doctor, who lived in one of the poorest counties in the country, who worked land they did not own for wages that kept them perpetually in debt. This was not an offer they had any reason to refuse. 600 men came in. They were examined. They were given a diagnosis, not in medical terms, but in the language of the county. The doctors told them they had bad blood. It was a phrase everyone understood. It meant something was wrong inside you, something that needed to be watched. The doctors said they would take care of it. What the men were not told, what not one of them was ever told, was the truth. The truth was this. Of the 600 men enrolled in that study, 399 of them had syphilis. Active, untreated syphilis, a disease that, in its late stages, destroys the cardiovascular system, attacks the brain, causes blindness, insanity, and a death that takes years. And the doctors from the United States Public Health Service had no intention of treating them. Not that summer, not the following year, not in 1947, when penicillin became the standard of care, and a single injection could have cured every man in that room. Not ever, because that was the study. That was the entire point. The United States government wanted to know what happened to black men when syphilis was left to run its course. They wanted to watch the disease progress, through the skin sores of the early stage, through the latent years of apparent health, into the devastation of the late stage. They wanted autopsy data. They wanted to chart the destruction of human bodies from the inside. And they needed the men alive and sick to do it. The study was supposed to last 6 months. It lasted 40 years. 40 years. From 1932 to 1972. Through the Great Depression, through World War II, through the Korean War, through the Civil Rights Movement, through the assassinations of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King, Jr., through the moon landing, through 4 decades of American history, these men showed up for their appointments. They took their placebos, they received their free meals, and they died. Slowly. Without ever knowing why. By the time the study was finally exposed, not by a government conscience, not by a congressional investigation, but by a single whistleblower who leaked documents to a reporter, 28 men had died directly from syphilis. 100 more had died from complications. 40 of their wives had been infected. 19 of their children had been born with the disease. Their names are documented. Their deaths are documented. Their suffering is documented in the clinical language of government reports that were published in peer-reviewed medical journals with no objection from the medical community throughout the entire 40 years the study ran. This is not a story about a secret program. It is not a story about classified files or destroyed documents or programs that had to be pried from the government through Freedom of Information requests. The Tuskegee syphilis study was published. Openly. In the most respected medical journals in the country, the researchers presented their findings at conferences. They won awards. They were promoted. Nobody objected. For 40 years, nobody objected. That is what makes this story different from every other story this channel has told. MKUltra was hidden. Operation Midnight Climax was buried. The files were burned. This one was out in the open, and it still took 40 years for anyone to stop it. Stay with me. To understand why this study was possible, you need to understand what Macon County, Alabama looked like in 1932. Macon County had a population of roughly 27,000 people. 82% of them were black. Most of them were sharecroppers, tenant farmers who worked land owned by white families and received a portion of the harvest in exchange. In practice, The system kept them perpetually indebted. The accounting was done by the landowners. The prices were set by the landowners. Generation after generation, families worked land they could never own, for wages that were never quite enough to get ahead. In 1932, Macon County had one of the highest rates of syphilis in the United States. The Public Health Service knew this. They had been studying syphilis rates in black communities in the South as part of a broader effort to understand the disease. And in the summer of 1932, a researcher named Dr. Taliaferro Clark proposed something new. Clark's proposal was, on its surface, a scientific question. Researchers at the time believed, based on very limited evidence, that syphilis manifested differently in black men than in white men. In white men, they theorized, the disease primarily attacked the central nervous system. In black men, they believed, it attacked the cardiovascular system instead. Clark wanted to study this. He wanted to observe a group of black men with untreated syphilis over an extended period, to document the natural progression of the disease, to see what it actually did to the body over time. There was one significant ethical problem with this proposal. By 1932, treatments for syphilis existed. They were not particularly effective. The standard treatment involved painful injections of arsenical compounds and applications of mercury. But they were treatments. The medical standard of care for syphilis was to treat it. Clark's study required not treating it. The Public Health Service approved his proposal anyway. The study was built on a foundation of deception from the very first day. The men were told they had bad blood, that vague catch-all phrase, and that the government doctors were going to help them. They were given aspirin and iron tonic and told it was treatment. They were given free hot meals on examination days. They were given burial insurance, a powerful incentive in a community where the cost of a funeral could devastate a family. At the center of the operation was a black nurse named Eunice Rivers. Rivers was a trusted figure in the community, known, respected, familiar. The Public Health Service assigned her as the primary contact for the study participants. She was their connection to the program. She drove them to their appointments. She reminded them to come in. She was the face they trusted. Rivers later said she believed, for many years, that the men were receiving some form of care. She said she did not fully understand the nature of the study. Whether that is entirely true is something historians have debated. What is certain is that her role, a trusted black woman in a community with deep reason to distrust white government institutions, was essential to keeping the men enrolled and cooperative for 4 decades. The study originally planned to run for 6 months. By the end of those 6 months, the researchers had concluded there was insufficient data. They needed more time. They needed the men to keep coming back. The 6-month study became a 1-year study, then a 5-year study, then indefinite. In 1943, penicillin was identified as an effective treatment for syphilis. By 1947, it was the standard of care, recommended by every major medical authority, available across the country, cheap to produce, and easy to administer. A single course of penicillin could cure syphilis. The men in Macon County were not offered penicillin. They were not told it existed. They were not told that the disease they had, the disease the government knew they had and had never told them about, could now be cured with a simple injection. The researchers made an active decision to continue the study. They reasoned, and this reasoning is documented in their own memos, that offering treatment would destroy the scientific value of the data. If the men were cured, there would be nothing left to observe. The study would end. And the data on the late-stage progression of untreated syphilis in black men, data that the researchers had spent 15 years collecting, would be incomplete. The science, they decided, was more important than the lives. During World War II, 256 of the infected men in the study registered for the draft. They were diagnosed with syphilis at military induction centers, as required by law, and ordered to obtain treatment before they could be inducted into the armed services. The Public Health Service intervened. They contacted the draft board. They explained that these men were participants in an ongoing scientific study. They asked that the men be exempted from the treatment requirement. The request was granted. 256 men who could have been cured, who had been legally ordered to be cured, were returned to Macon County without treatment. Returned to the study. Returned to the slow progression of a disease that was killing them. The researchers sent letters to each of them. The letters informed the men that they were receiving, and I'm quoting from the actual letter, special free treatment. Special free treatment. The treatment was aspirin. As the years passed, the disease progressed. Late-stage syphilis, tertiary syphilis, is not a quiet death. It attacks the cardiovascular system, causing aortic aneurysms that rupture without warning. It penetrates the central nervous system, causing dementia, personality changes, loss of motor control. It causes gummas, soft tissue tumors that can appear anywhere in the body. It causes blindness. It causes insanity. The researchers documented all of this. That was the point. Every death was an autopsy. Every autopsy was data. The men had been promised burial insurance. And the burial insurance came with a condition, recorded in the study's own documents. The family had to agree to allow an autopsy. The government needed to examine the organs. The government needed to see what the disease had done. The families agreed. They needed the burial insurance. They could not have known what they were agreeing to. In 1969, an internal review panel within the Centers for Disease Control examined the study. By then, at least 28 men had died directly from syphilis, and possibly as many as 100. The panel had an opportunity to end it. They voted to continue. In 1966, a 27-year-old public health service investigator named Peter Buxton was assigned to a venereal disease program in San Francisco. In the course of his work, he came across records of the Tuskegee study. He was disturbed by what he read. He wrote a memo to his superiors expressing his concerns. The study, he said, was unethical. The men had not consented to participate in a study of untreated syphilis. They were not being told the truth about their condition. They were not being offered a cure that existed and that they could have received. His superiors responded. They told him his concerns had been noted. The study continued. Buxton wrote again in 1968. He was more forceful this time. He argued that the study was, in the climate of the civil rights movement, a liability. That if it became public knowledge that the United States government had been withholding treatment from black men in the rural South for nearly 4 decades, the consequences would be severe. His superiors convened a review panel. The review panel, which included no black members, concluded that the study should continue until all participants had died and been autopsied. Peter Buxton left the public health service. He went to law school. He became a lawyer, and he kept the documents he had collected. In 1972, he gave them to a friend who worked as a reporter. That friend passed them to Gene Heller, an investigative reporter at the Associated Press. On July 25, 1972, Heller's story ran on the front pages of newspapers across the country. The reaction was immediate. Senator Edward Kennedy called for congressional hearings. The Department of Health, Education, and Welfare convened an advisory panel. Within months, the study was officially terminated. It had taken 40 years. It had taken one person who refused to let it go. And it had taken a reporter willing to print it. By the time it ended, 28 men had died directly from syphilis. 100 more had died from related complications. 40 wives had been infected. 19 children had been born with congenital syphilis. Among the survivors was a man named Herman Shaw. He had enrolled in the study as a young man in the 1930s. He was in his 80s when President Clinton invited him to the White House in 1997. Shaw stood at a podium in the East Room and said something that stopped the room. He said he was not bitter. He said he hoped that by what happened to him and the other men, medical science had learned something that would prevent it from happening again. He said he forgave. He was 94 years old. He had lived with the knowledge of what had been done to him for 25 years. He had watched his friends die. He had watched the government that deceived him eventually apologize to him in the most formal setting possible. The White House, the President of the United States, cameras rolling. And he forgave. Charlie Pollard, another survivor, had a different response. When he learned the true nature of the study he had participated in for decades, when a civil rights attorney named Fred Gray explained to him exactly what had been done, Pollard said simply, "I thought they was treating us." That sentence, 7 words, captures everything. On May 16, 1997, President Bill Clinton stood in the East Room of the White House and issued a formal presidential apology on behalf of the United States government. He said, "The United States government did something that was wrong, deeply, profoundly, morally wrong. It was an outrage to our commitment to integrity and equality for all our citizens. What was done cannot be undone, but we can end the silence." 8 survivors attended the ceremony. 5 came in person. 3 were represented by family members. The last study participant died in 2004. The last widow receiving benefits from the settlement died in 2009. The settlement reached in 1974, a $10 million out-of-court agreement, divided the money into 4 categories. Living participants with syphilis received $37,500. Living controls received $16,000. The heirs of deceased participants received smaller amounts. No one was ever prosecuted. No researcher faced criminal charges. No government official was held legally accountable for 40 years of deliberate medical deception that killed more than 100 men and infected their families. The legacy of Tuskegee did not end with the apology. Researchers who have studied the long-term impact of the study have found something deeply troubling. In the years following the 1972 exposure, Black American men, particularly in the South, became significantly less likely to seek medical care, less likely to see doctors, less likely to trust the healthcare system. One study found that the gap in life expectancy between black and white men in the United States widened measurably in the years after the Tuskegee study became public. The researchers calculated that reduced medical care-seeking behavior among black men, directly attributable to Tuskegee-related distrust, may have caused as many as 35,000 additional deaths between 1972 and 1990. The study ended in 1972. The death toll did not. During the COVID-19 pandemic, researchers documented that distrust of government medical programs, traced explicitly by survey respondents to the Tuskegee study, was a significant factor in vaccine hesitancy among some black Americans. A study conducted in 2021 found that counties with higher historical exposure to the Tuskegee program had lower COVID vaccination rates decades later. The researchers who ran that study from 1932 to 1972 could not have imagined any of this. They were thinking about data, about publications, about the progression of a disease in a population they did not consider fully human. They could not have imagined that their decisions, made in government offices in Washington and in a county clinic in Alabama, would still be killing people 50 years later, but they were. In 2009, a legacy museum opened at Tuskegee University, built to honor the men who were deceived by their government for 40 years. In 2022, 50 years after the study was exposed, the Milbank Memorial Fund, one of the organizations that had funded the research, issued a formal apology to the descendants of the victims. The names of the men in the study are documented. They are available. There are organizations dedicated to preserving their stories and supporting their descendants. They were not anonymous. They were not abstractions. They were men with families and names and histories, men who trusted their government and were destroyed by that trust. What makes the Tuskegee syphilis study different from everything else this channel has covered is exactly that openness. MKUltra was hidden. Operation Midnight Climax was buried. The men behind those programs destroyed their files because they knew what they had done. The researchers at Tuskegee published their findings in the New England Journal of Medicine. They presented at conferences. They applied for grants. They used their data to build careers. And for 40 years, the American medical establishment read those papers, attended those conferences, and said nothing. Not one physician published a letter of objection. Not one ethics board intervened. Not one. The Tuskegee study led directly to the Belmont Report of 1979. the foundational document of modern research ethics in the United States. It led to the requirement for informed consent in all federally funded research. It led to institutional review boards, to oversight committees, to the entire architecture of protections that now governs how human subjects are used in scientific research. Those protections exist because of what happened to those 600 men in Macon County, Alabama. Because of what was done to them. Because of what was taken from them, Herman Shaw forgave. But forgiveness is not the same as forgetting, and it is not the same as accountability. No one was ever charged. No one was ever prosecuted. The men who designed this study, who kept it running for 40 years, who voted in 1969 to continue it after 100 men had already died, they retired with their honors intact. They were never asked to answer for any of it. If this story matters to you, if you think these men deserve to be remembered, share this video. Because most people know the name Tuskegee. Very few people know the names Herman Shaw, Charlie Pollard, Carter Howard, Fred Simmons, Frederick Moss. Now you do. Next week we are covering Operation Paperclip, the program that brought over 1,600 Nazi scientists to the United States after World War II, gave them new identities, and put them to work for the American government. Subscribe if you don't want to miss it. I'll see you in the next one.